Okay, I'd like to take a moment to introduce my august panel of colleagues here. Starting from the other end, we have Rabbi Brian Glusman, who is the Director of Outreach at the JCC. He is a post-denominational rabbi and also is trained as a family, couple, and sex therapist. Next to him is Rabbi Zev Farber, Rabbi Dr. Zev Farber, who completed his Ph.D. recently at Emory University in Bible and is one of the founders of Torah.com. Immediately next to me is Rabbi Zalman Lipskier, who is my colleague, the Chabad Rabbi at Emory University. And for those of you who weren't here at the very beginning, my name is Seeman. I'm a professor of Jewish Studies at Emory University. I wanted to start off by asking each of our panelists just to share a brief response of whatever they might have thought was most important to note about this film, and then hopefully we'll go right into question and answer and have some conversation. Can we start down at the end with Brian?
No, but I must say, an outstanding film, but this answers a lot of questions. I wondered why there were so many ghosts and demons and witches in my house, and now those questions have been answered by this movie clearly. Now, I thought the movie was outstanding. I thought very well done, but I'm a product of the Hebrew Academy in Atlanta, the Yeshiva High School of Atlanta, and I remember distinctly as a little kid, must have been the second, third, or fourth grade, a doctor came to speak to us, an Orthodox doctor, who told us that masturbation was horrible, it was a sin, it was very bad and wrong to do. And I just remember feeling horrified because I didn't know what masturbation was. And but I just remember being very, very scared and petrified. And you know, while I think that this movie is wonderful, from a Hasidic and a Haredi perspective, I think that in our world and our culture, the response needs to be a bit different. I remember a couple of years ago, I was asked to speak at the BBYO International Convention. There was one happening now. A few years ago, again, 1,000, 2,000 kids were here, and I gave a class on sexuality. And at the end of the class, I said very clearly, and I said, I can be quoted, it is a mitzvah to masturbate. I remember saying this very clearly. I said, because in today's world, the dangers, the problems, having sex at an age, at a time that's not appropriate, you're too young, that masturbation is a great option. Pikuach nefesh docher hakol, saving a life supersedes everything. And I think we can save lives if perhaps we masturbate more and not have sex when we're not supposed to. So, what happened right after that is that this was tweeted all over the world. Rabbi says that masturbation is a mitzvah, and I wasn't invited back to the BBYO convention. But
I'm going to leave that without comment. Rabbi Farber.
It's hard to follow a sex therapist. And, so I'll react to the movie in a couple ways. That the movie was well done, that I agree. But two things fundamentally bothered me about the movie when I watched it. One is there is this implicit assumption that his take on what Judaism says is factually correct, right? Shmirat habrit, a term I never heard in my life till I saw this movie, and I've been through the entire Shulchan Aruch, including the pages that he was opening. And by the way, there was misquotes there. But I think that puts a certain amount of pressure on people to think that, okay, this is authentic Judaism. And then some of us, the more modernisher people, well, so we don't do all of it. If you really want to do all of it, that's the way to do it. I think that's a misnomer. I think that Judaism is a complicated thing and there's many different versions of it. I'm sure that there is Shmirat habrit in many books, but many books have other things. I would also say that it's a very ahistorical perspective. A lot of the issues around masturbation, when you read them in ancient literature, including Jewish literature, has to do with a theory called homunculus, which has to do with this idea that you're actually killing somebody. If you hear some of the rhetoric that they said, even though actually, technically, what the Gemara actually says is Kol ha'oches ba'amo mashin mevium lavul ba'olam, which is actually quite funny. It actually says that anyone who holds his penis and urinates, it's as if he brings a flood to the world.
Well, it depends on what you drank that day.
Yes. I always thought the rabbis were trying to be a little bit humorous there. They mean Noah's flood because God was going to destroy the world. So those things bother me. The other thing that bothers me is that many of the people who spoke here were very insightful. I thought that the educator who said things like be open with your kids and let them have an open communication was very good. I thought the advice about love and wives, that was all very nice. However, the reality is when you see studies and you hear other anecdotal evidence that things aren't always so simple. And in a world where you suggest something like these magical thinking, like if you say 10 Psalms in Uman, you'll be guaranteed forever never to masturbate until you get married. And then you find that doesn't necessarily statistically work out. There's a lot of pressure that you're a murderer, and you bring it, even with all the more positive rhetoric, there is a lot, I think, of damage that occurs to people who feel this weight of guilt on them. So I think that this was a very positive spin. I would be surprised if studies bore out that this is actually the way most people feel about it, and that it's all as positive as it was sold.
I got my own.
Yeah.
Okay.
So as being the only chassid in the room, I feel a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
So first of all, I don't know one of those pairs of underwears, and I did shower. So now that we got that out of the way. So I watched the film with my wife, and a month ago, and they asked me to be on this panel, and I had some of the same reactions you had. Masterfully done in bringing such a sensitive topic to film. Some of my reactions is talk about murder and the guilt that brings on, and thinking about murder. So the first thing I thought, because my wife said the same thing, because we hadn't had apparently extensive discussions about this up until this point, apparently. So she says that what's all this all about? It's like a new world for her to some degree. So so I said that the Talmud actually, in the halacha, has brought down there are a lot of things that are compared to murder. It says if you embarrass someone in public, it's compared to murder. If you speak lashon hara, slander, it's compared to murder. And I actually found so that was my own gut reaction. Is like, okay, so perhaps the sages are making a strong statement here to say its importance, but is it really considered murder? I actually found the source in the Pnei Yeshua, an Achro, in the 16th century, who writes that it was specifically done. The rabbi said lahaflig et ha'inyan, to sort of emphasize its importance, just like you find other things that is like murder. To me, one of my main point, I guess, would be that people constructed Judaism around different ideas, different themes, and there are people that say that the most important thing in Judaism is not to speak lashon hara. That's the worst thing, and that's going to destroy the world. And then you could find every theme and every topic of what people will say the most important mitzvah in the Torah is. And in Breslov, Tikkun HaBrit, or keeping the covenant sacred, or sacred sperm as the name of the film, is the central gateway to Judaism. The way I grew up as a chassid, as a Chabad chassid, in the tradition of Baal Shem Tov, was very different. There's a custom in Chabad that these topics are specifically not spoken about because, ironically, it's paradoxical intentions. When you speak so much about something, sometimes you're making it, you're sort of exacerbating the problem rather than solving it. And that term was hesach hadas. Yes, it's something that's brought down in halacha and it's spoken about its importance, about how sacred it is and how special sexuality is, but not to dwell on it, to dwell on the joy of serving God and taking every experience in life, especially the most sensual things in life, like sexuality, and finding purpose and meaning in it, and not finding, the one thing, sort of this negative approach where it's only about, we got to watch out from this big, elephant in the room, otherwise we're going to, you're going to burn in hell or something, but it's going to be something disastrous.
Thank you. I'll just share two comments. First of all, as an Orthodox Jew, I was sitting in the theater squirming a little bit during this film because it's although I didn't grow up the way that this film portrays either, but it's a little bit like seeing one's kind of dirty laundry exposed, or having kind of one's religious community held up to potential ridicule. And I think that the filmmaker did a very difficult balance, held a very difficult balance here between trying to portray something in positive terms, but not really, but not whitewashing the fact that there are difficulties and there are things that that he himself had trouble with and didn't understand. I give him credit for that. One of the things that's important as an anthropologist that I note is that this kind of concern with the wasted seed and in general with masturbation is not just a kind of quaint, ultra-Orthodox thing. Most societies in the world have had this either in their distant or not so distant past. To this day in India, you can go to the doctor and complain of semen loss. It's an illness which is recognized in India, and there are treatments for it. So it's important to sort of take this in a broader comparative context as well. And the final thing that I will say is that it's important when watching a film like this to suspend one's disbelief. To try to enter sympathetically into somebody else's world doesn't necessarily mean that you have to walk out and live in that world, but it does mean that it takes a certain effort on the part of an audience to arrive at a kind of empathetic understanding of a different way of being in the world. So I'm grateful to my colleagues here and to the organizers. Let's take some questions from the audience. Questions, comments? Just put up your hand, please, so we can bring you a microphone.
Do young women in this community have any education before they get married?
I'm sorry, I don't see who's at. Oh, there you are. Zalman, do you want to speak to that?
I mean, community, I can speak for my own community. I mean, the Jewish community is wide and varied. And the answer is yes. There is a forum for the way I grew up, at least, where we discuss and can learn. And if you have questions, there's someone to speak to in the yeshiva. I can't speak for every, I grew up where I grew up, so I can speak to how we were raised.
My understanding is that there is education, but it's different. The girls and the boys learn a different curriculum. They study in single-sex programs from a very young age, and it's different. And I suspect that much of the emphasis on the topic of this film is probably absent from girls' education, but that's a very good question.
I guess it's somewhat related to what she just asked, but I guess I wonder if there are any set rules for women in terms of masturbation, because there's not like as much of the quote-unquote spilling of the seed. So I guess I'm just wondering how it applies to women with masturbation.
Well, since none of us are women on the panel, I'll speak for women. My sense is that it's a less fraught issue because of the issue of seed, which is not to say that Hasidic educators don't care, but that it's simply a less fraught issue. And I think there's also an assumption, which may or may not be true, but which we heard many times in the film, that it's simply more of an issue for boys than for girls. There's an assumption that young males have this kind of overpowering desire. My guess is that there's a lot less explicit discourse around this and less pressure surrounding this for girls, but I don't know for sure.
So if you just turn, again, I'm not a Hasidic woman, I'm going to admit that now, but in the literature, I mean, if you read the books, the Shulchan Aruch and all the commentaries, there is virtually nothing about that subject. I think there's two reasons. On a technical level, you'll say because the category is spelling seed, and if there's no seed, so there's no sin. On top of that, remember the religion formed in ancient times, where the Talmud is explicit that it doesn't know about eggs in women. It thinks that the semen is the person. It enters the woman is like the oven. It cooks, and then it puts it out. So they don't really think that anything bad happens. The third thing I would mention is, when it comes to halachic literature, it is very male-centered. So males think a lot about male masturbation. They think a lot about sex with women, but they don't think a lot about women when the men aren't there masturbating. So it's just not very much on their minds. I think that in the past 100 or 200 years, with a lot of advances about thinking about women's sexuality, these things might be coming up, but they'll be coming up in a way that is less obvious because it won't be in most of the ancient literature.
I just want to add one thing. The Talmud does speak about women masturbating, and not to get into the details of it, but like I think just to say the rabbis weren't aware of it and it wasn't discussed, it's clearly brought down in the Halacha in the Gemara.
I was going to ask for details. It sounds kind of fun, but
we can have an after party. Then we can talk about it.
I do want to say though that speaking of women, the idea that a woman goes to there's a lot about women. Obviously, semen is life force. So too menstruation. When a woman menstruates, there's a life force that's dealt with as well. And in both cases, we're in a ritual state of impurity after those things happen. Women in today's world go to a mikveh afterwards. In the ancient world, when a man spilled semen, if he had a nocturnal emission, which is what they used to call a wet dream, the man would go to a mikveh, immerse himself in water. It's interesting that no longer do men have to go to the mikveh after an emission, but women continue to go to the mikveh after menstrual cycle.
I would point out that in the Hasidic community, it is still a common practice.
And mikvahs would be very busy, really.
Other questions from the audience?
Regarding reproductive technology.
I just don't see where, can you raise your hand? Yes, please.
Regarding reproductive technology, particularly IVF, the question has come up regarding what is within the limits of Orthodox Judaism, particularly semen collection. Now, I did notice in the film that they had frozen sperm in the early segment of the film, and they mentioned that it's a neurogenic stimulation to collect the semen. Is that, what are the guidelines there? Or
so there are a variety of opinions about how to go about collecting semen for IVF. Without getting into great detail here, I think that the community that we're talking about is more strict about this than many other Orthodox rabbis who are involved with IVF. And if you notice, even in the film, they mentioned that this was sort of what they do for Haredi young men or ultra-Orthodox young men. It's not the only method of collection.
Right, but is IVF still considered a way to conceive?
Oh, so the question is IVF considered a way to conceive? Well, there is some argumentation about this in the Orthodox world. The truth is that in particular in Israel, it's become quite widespread. And it's done under rabbinic auspices. In other words, there's a mashgiach, the same way you have one in a restaurant. So they have a mashgiach or mashgicha usually, at the IVF clinic to make sure that things are done properly, that the sperm samples are not mixed up, as has sometimes happened in other parts of the world, and so forth. So yes, there's an excellent book about this by my friend Susan Kahn. It's called Reproducing Jews, and it's all about the technicalities of IVF in Israel among Orthodox Jews. The real question is where the sperm is allowed to come from if it can't come from the husband. And one of the rules that is employed in Israel is that if the sperm can't come from the husband, it has to come from a non-Jewish source because they want to avoid the possibility of problems relating to adultery or the entry of a third Jewish party into that marital relation. But read Sukhan's book, you'll get all the details there. Yes.
Yeah, the concept of spilling seed, as expressed in the film, deals with that during childbearing years. What is the prohibition or not after the childbearing years?
Well, what you're pointing to is actually an interesting problem in general in halacha, which is there's this tension between the idea of not spilling seed in vain, and everything is about procreation, which was a lot of the rhetoric in the movie. But on the other hand, the halacha books, the Talmud, are full of cases of, that people have sex when the woman is past childbearing age, and that's not going to be reproductive. There's discussions of sexual activities where seed is spilled in the Shulchan Aruch that some of the rabbis believe is not a problem. There's talk about sex with pregnant women, talk about sex with infertile women. So to some extent, even though there's a lot of talk about wasted seed, it often comes down to masturbation as an act. The term they use there, niyuf bayad, adultery with the hand. That there's a concern about that more than the seed itself, even though the reason ostensibly is the seed.
In other words, when the sexuality is permissible between a married couple, it doesn't matter whether that particular sexual act can or cannot lead to a child. Last question.
Let me ask you this. It's a seed. When does life begin? Is it not a sperm in the egg? Why do we put so much emphasis on sperm? Life begins, on conception. It's just a seed. People wash their hands, they wash, the dirt off the dirt off. We're just washing off something that's just,
I think part of the answer is what Rabbi Farber was referring to before, which is pre-modern theories of procreation. But honestly, the question of when life begins is really a very fraught issue when it comes to matters like abortion, and especially in this country with its kind of overwhelming Christian civilization. I'm not sure that's the issue here, and I think that the issue is that force-giving life, potential life, is worthy of protection. So I don't think that this particular issue is framed so much around the question of exactly when life begins, but there are other conversations that are.
Just can I add a point?
Okay.
So Maimonides writes when he speaks about, he doesn't speak about it in the context of a spilling seed, but he speaks about Shechvat Zera, about the force, semen that a person has, and he speaks about how it's centered, it's the strength of a person, and each person should safeguard it. I think in the broader, metaphysical or spiritual Kabbalistic concept, it's not so much about the spilling of the seed as much as it's one of the deepest forces, if not the deepest force of a human being. And one should guard it. And just in the broader sense, one should guard it and cherish it and use it. Use it, not the seed specifically, but the sexual energy ideally should be experienced in the most purposeful, happy, connected, loving way.
We're going to have to end it here because of time, but I hope as people leave, they'll walk away thinking about how this film stands as a counterpoint to a lot of things going on in our own society.